Something happened last night that you were never supposed to understand immediately. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a feeling that appeared in the middle of an ordinary moment. You may have felt unusually thoughtful. You may have remembered someone you had not spoken to in a while. You may have looked at your phone without knowing why. You may have felt that strange pull in your heart that seems to arrive without an invitation, and now there is a message you need to hear, not because you should be afraid, not because something terrible is destined to happen, but because sometimes life places a question in front of your heart before it reveals the answer. The title of this message sounds shocking. A woman has passed away in the life story surrounding your soulmate. And the question is, who was she? Before you let fear enter your heart, understand what this story is really about. This is not a prediction of someone's death. It is a symbolic message about endings, memories, family connections, old chapters, and the emotional weight your soulmate may have been carrying long before you realized how deeply their past affected their future. Sometimes when people say that someone has passed away from a person's life, they mean something much deeper than physical death. A relationship ended, a chapter closed, a friendship disappeared, a family connection changed. A person who once had enormous influence no longer holds the same place, and sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones nobody else can see. That is where this story begins. Last night, something shifted. Your soulmate may have been sitting somewhere quietly, looking at an old photograph, remembering a conversation, thinking about someone from years ago, or simply staring into the darkness while memories moved through their mind. They were not necessarily thinking about you at first, but somehow, the memory of you entered that moment. And that is where everything became different, because when someone carries unfinished emotions from the past, they sometimes do not recognize how those emotions affect the way they love in the present. Your soulmate may have spent a long time protecting themselves. They may have learned to stay silent. They may have learned not to explain everything. They may have learned to walk away before someone could disappoint them. They may have learned to hide their softer emotions behind confidence, distance, humor, work, or silence, and perhaps you wondered why. Why could they not simply say what they felt? Why did they sometimes come closer and then pull away? Why did their energy seem warm one day and distant the next? Why did it feel as though there was an invisible wall between your heart and theirs? There may have been a reason, and that reason may have had nothing to do with your worth. It may have been connected to something they experienced long before you entered their story. There was a woman in the background of their life. Maybe she was a mother, maybe she was a grandmother, maybe she was an aunt, maybe she was an older relative. Maybe she was a family friend who played a role so important that your soulmate never completely forgot her. Or perhaps, symbolically, she represents a woman from their past who shaped the way they understand love. That is the mystery. Who was she? And why does her story seem connected to yours? The answer may surprise you. Because the important thing is not simply who she was, the important thing is what she represented. She represented a lesson your soulmate had not yet finished learning. She represented an old emotional pattern. She represented something your soulmate had carried quietly for years, and last night, that old chapter may have come back into their thoughts with unusual intensity. Imagine your soulmate alone for a moment. The world around them is quiet, the phone is nearby, the lights are low. There is nothing dramatic happening on the outside, yet inside, something is moving. A memory appears, a face, a voice, a room from childhood. A familiar expression, a sentence someone once said, and suddenly, your soulmate realizes something they had avoided admitting. They have been carrying an old story into a new chapter. They have been allowing the past to speak louder than the present. They have been expecting the future to repeat what happened before, and perhaps, without realizing it, they have been protecting themselves from love by keeping one hand on the door of the past. But your presence has changed that. Something about you made it harder for them to remain emotionally asleep. You may have awakened feelings they thought they had buried. You may have reminded them that genuine connection still exists. You may have made them question the walls they built around themselves. And that is why the message feels so urgent. Because this is not really about a woman disappearing from a story. It is about an old version of your soulmate disappearing. The version who was afraid to trust. The version who believed love always came with pain. The version who thought vulnerability was weakness. The version who believed they had to handle everything alone. That version is reaching an ending, and something new is trying to begin. You may have noticed signs of this without knowing what they meant. Maybe communication changed. Maybe their attitude became softer. Maybe they started remembering small details about you. Maybe they began asking questions they never asked before. Maybe they became more thoughtful. Maybe they seemed unusually quiet. Maybe they suddenly appeared to understand something about your connection that they had previously dismissed. Sometimes transformation does not arrive with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it arrives as silence. A person becomes quieter because they are thinking. They become more careful because they finally understand the consequences of their choices. They become more honest because pretending has become exhausting, and your soulmate may be approaching that moment. There is another possibility you should consider. The woman in this symbolic story may represent someone your soulmate once trusted completely. Someone who taught them what loyalty meant, someone who influenced their decisions, someone whose opinion mattered enormously. Perhaps this woman encouraged them to be strong. Perhaps she told them not to settle. Perhaps she taught them to protect their heart. Perhaps she warned them that people are not always what they appear to be. And while some of those lessons may have protected your soulmate, others may have unintentionally caused them to become afraid of intimacy. They learned how to survive, but they did not necessarily learn how to receive love. There is a difference. Survival teaches you to watch the door. Love teaches you that sometimes you can finally sit down and breathe. Survival tells you to expect disappointment. Love says you don't have to carry everything alone. Survival makes you suspicious of tenderness. Love teaches you that tenderness can be safe. Your soulmate may be learning that difference now, and you may be part of the reason. Not because you are responsible for fixing them, you are not. Not because you are supposed to rescue them, you are not. But because your connection may have shown them something they could no longer ignore. You showed them that being understood feels different from being admired. You showed them that attention is not the same as connection. You showed them that real affection requires honesty. And perhaps most importantly, you showed them that someone can see their imperfections. Without immediately walking away, that realization can frighten a person who has spent years hiding. It can also transform them. Last night may have been emotionally significant because your soulmate finally allowed themselves to remember something they had been avoiding. Perhaps they remembered the woman who once told them something about love. Maybe they remembered a warning. Maybe they remembered an act of kindness. Maybe they remembered a mistake. Maybe they remembered a goodbye. And in that memory, they recognized you, not literally as the same person, but emotionally. They recognized a quality in you that reminded them of something important: patience, warmth, understanding, strength. Or perhaps simply the feeling of being able to breathe. Around someone, that can be powerful. Sometimes we do not fall for a person because they are perfect. We fall because something about them makes us feel like we can finally stop pretending. And your soulmate may be realizing that. There is a question hidden inside this entire story. What happens when someone finally understands what they almost lost? That question may be closer to the heart of this message than anything else. Because your soulmate may have underestimated the importance of your connection. They may have thought there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another moment, another chance to explain, but time has a way of teaching people that nothing should be taken for granted. People change, circumstances change, priorities change. And sometimes the opportunity to speak is standing in front of you today, not waiting somewhere in an imaginary tomorrow. This is why the energy around your soulmate may feel different. They may be thinking about reaching out. They may be thinking about what they would say. They may be replaying old conversations. They may be wondering whether you still care. They may be asking themselves whether they waited too long, and perhaps they are afraid of the answer. But fear does not mean there is no hope. Fear often appears precisely when something matters. If nothing mattered, there would be nothing to lose. Your soulmate may be discovering that their feelings are stronger than their defenses. And this is where the mysterious woman enters the story again. Who was she? Perhaps she was the person who taught them that love should always be protected. Perhaps she was the person who experienced disappointment and passed that fear down. Perhaps she was someone your soulmate loved deeply and associated with a chapter of life they believed they had already closed. Whatever her identity represents, her presence in the story points toward the past, and the message points toward the future. You cannot build a new future while constantly negotiating with an old wound. At some point, you have to say, I learned from what happened, I respect what happened, I honor what happened, but I do not have to become what happened. That may be the lesson your soulmate is approaching. They can honor their past without living inside it. They can remember someone without remaining emotionally trapped. They can appreciate what they were taught while choosing a different path. And they can love again without betraying the memories that shaped them. That is a beautiful kind of healing. It does not erase the past. It changes its place in the present. Perhaps this is why you have been feeling that something is shifting. Maybe you cannot explain it. Maybe nothing obvious has happened yet. but something inside the connection feels different. Do not force an interpretation. Do not assume every coincidence is a supernatural instruction. Instead, allow the message to remind you of something practical and powerful. People reveal their truth through their actions. If your soulmate wants a future with you, let their actions demonstrate it. If they want to communicate, allow them to communicate. If they want to repair something, let them participate in the repair. You do not need to chase someone into honesty. You do not need to prove your value. You do not need to become smaller to make someone comfortable. You deserve a connection where communication is mutual. You deserve respect. You deserve emotional safety. And if this story is speaking to your heart, perhaps its deepest message is not, something terrible happened. Perhaps it is, something old is ending. That is a completely different message. An ending can be frightening when you do not know what comes next, but an ending can also be the doorway through which peace enters. Think about how many times you have outgrown something without realizing it: a friendship, a habit, a belief, a fear, a version of yourself. At the time, it may have felt like loss. Later, you understood it as growth. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar. They may be realizing that the person they had to become to survive their past is not necessarily the person they need to remain in order to build their future. That realization can be uncomfortable. It can make someone emotional. It can make someone withdraw temporarily. It can make them reconsider choices, but it can also make them honest. And honesty is where meaningful relationships begin. There is another hidden layer to this story. Maybe the woman was not someone who caused pain at all. Maybe she was someone who loved your soulmate fiercely. Maybe she was the person who always believed they could become more. Maybe she was the person who told them not to waste their life being afraid. Maybe she was the person who encouraged them to follow their heart. If so, then perhaps the memory of her is not a warning. Perhaps it is an encouragement. Imagine your soulmate remembering those words. Imagine them thinking about the life they have built. Imagine them asking themselves, am I really living honestly? Am I allowing myself to love? Am I choosing happiness? Am I hiding because it is easier? Those questions can change a person, and perhaps you are connected to the answer, not because destiny forces two people together, but because meaningful connections sometimes become mirrors. You see yourself differently through another person's eyes. Your soulmate may have seen parts of themselves through you that they had forgotten existed: their tenderness, their hope, their humor, their vulnerability, their desire for companionship, their ability to dream. You may have reminded them that they are more than their history. And perhaps they are beginning to believe it. So when this message asks, who was that woman? The answer may not be a single name. She may represent every woman who shaped your soulmate's understanding of life, every memory that still carries emotional weight, every lesson that became a belief, every fear disguised as wisdom, every old goodbye that still whispers, "Don't get too close." And now that whisper is being challenged. Because something inside your soulmate wants to move forward. That does not mean everything changes overnight. Real emotional growth is rarely instant. It happens in small decisions. A person chooses honesty instead of avoidance. they choose communication instead of silence. They choose accountability instead of excuses. They choose courage instead of fear. They choose to say what they feel. They choose to listen. They choose to show up. Those small choices eventually create a completely different life, and perhaps that is what you are being invited to watch for. Not dramatic promises, not mysterious predictions, not impossible signs, actions. Look for consistency. Look for respect. Look for genuine communication. Look for a willingness to repair what has been damaged. Look for someone who does not simply say, "I care," but behaves like they care. That is where the real miracle is. Because love is not merely a feeling, love is also behavior. Love is patience. Love is honesty. Love is accountability. Love is giving another person room to be human. And your soulmate may be learning this now. Perhaps last night was the emotional beginning of that realization. Perhaps something reminded them of a woman from their past. Perhaps they opened an old message. Perhaps they found a photograph. Perhaps they heard a song that carried a memory. Perhaps someone mentioned her name. Or perhaps nothing external happened at all, maybe. The event happened entirely inside their own heart. Sometimes that is enough. A person can be sitting perfectly still while their entire understanding of life changes. That may be what happened. And perhaps when the memory ended, they thought of you. Maybe they wondered where you were. Maybe they wondered whether you were okay. Maybe they wondered if you still believed in the possibility of something meaningful between you. Maybe they imagined what they would say if they had another chance. And maybe, for the first time, they realized that silence had become more painful than honesty. That is a powerful turning point. But remember something important: you do not have to wait. In fear for someone else's transformation, your life is happening too. Your heart deserves peace while another person figures out what they want. You can care without abandoning yourself. You can love without losing your identity. You can hope without making promises on someone else's behalf. You can believe in a connection while still requiring healthy behavior. That is not coldness. That is wisdom. The divine message here is not asking you to panic. It is asking you to release fear. Release the need to know every detail. Release the temptation to turn uncertainty into catastrophe. Sometimes the mind sees one unanswered question and creates 10 frightening answers. Do not do that to yourself. If your soulmate has something important to tell you, let them tell you. If something happened in their family or personal life, allow real information to come from real people. If someone is grieving, treat that grief with compassion rather than turning it into a prediction. And if the death in this story is symbolic, let it symbolize what needs to end: fear, avoidance, old patterns, emotional confusion, the habit of running from love, the belief that vulnerability is weakness, the belief that everyone eventually leaves, the belief that happiness is temporary. Those things can end. And when they do, something beautiful can begin. Maybe your soulmate is finally learning that love does not require perfection. Maybe they are learning that two people can disagree and still communicate. Maybe they are learning that trust is built through consistency. Maybe they are learning that vulnerability does not mean surrendering all boundaries. Maybe they are learning that a healthy relationship gives both people space to grow. These are not small lessons. They can change an entire future. There is also something you need to understand about your own heart. You may have spent too much time asking, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? Will they return? Do they miss me? Are they going to reach out? Those questions are understandable, but there is another question that matters just as much. What do I need? That question brings you back to yourself, and perhaps that is part of the transformation this message is trying to awaken. Your soulmate has their journey, you have yours. If your paths come together in a healthy way, beautiful. If communication needs to happen, let it happen honestly. If healing needs to happen first, let healing happen. Do not rush what needs time. Do not force what needs truth. Do not fear what needs to end. Because sometimes what ends is exactly what was preventing something healthier from beginning. That is the mystery behind the woman in this story. She represents an ending, but endings are not always tragedies. Sometimes endings are transitions. Sometimes they are releases. Sometimes they are the moment a person finally says, I cannot keep living like this. And perhaps your soulmate has reached that sentence. Maybe they are tired of running, tired of pretending, tired of keeping emotions hidden, tired of wondering what could have happened, tired of carrying old expectations into every new relationship. Maybe they are ready to become honest, and if they are, let honesty be proven through action.